Hi, I'm Laura Richcreek with Laura's Voice, and this is Laura Reads Foxed Books. Thanks for joining me. I am so glad you're here. This week, we continue reading The Old Gentleman of the Blackstock by Thomas Nelson Page, illustrated by Howard Chandler Christie. Original copyright 1897. This edition copyright 1901. However, as we know, this book is in the public domain. I've also added enrichment notes for your edification in the episode description. We are ready for Chapter 4, in which we get to know the old gentleman a bit more, well, intimately, as the chapter title suggests. Shall we? Without further ado, let's read Chapter 4 of The Old Gentleman of the Blackstock. 4. An Old Man's Intimates. Not long afterwards I met Mr. Miles. It was at the house of one of the old residents of the city, where I had become an occasional visitor, and where he had come that evening according to a weekly custom to play whist. He remembered me as his street acquaintance, and spoke of our first meeting at his gate, and our talk about the trees. He made no reference, however, to the incident from which my chief interest in him then sprang. He evidently did not know I was the one to whom he had given the advice about stopping a country carriage for a wife. The absence of some member of the family with whom he usually played whist seemed to cause him keen disappointment, and he appeared to regard it as so much of a misfortune that, partly through vanity and partly through complacence, I was induced to take a hand. I quickly found that I was outclassed, and that the haphazard, according to myself, game, which I then played, was worse than nothing. I misled him, forced his hand, lost him tricks, and finally lost him the rubber. This was more than he could stand. He would not play any more. With a reference to the rigor of the game, he rose from the table. The rest of the time he stayed, he talked about his health. I was feeling a little aggrieved over his strictures on my game, but when he had left, my host spoke of him with so much affection, and my hostess with so much pity, that I was quite mollified, and meeting him on the street next day, I stopped and spoke to him, asking him about his health, and taking occasion to apologize to him for my wretched performance the evening before, and the annoyance I had caused him. He appeared not only pleased at my attention, but gratified at my inquiry as to his health, and not only expressed regret for giving an exhibition of what he termed his constitutional irascibility, but invited me to call and see him, excusing himself for proposing so dull a duty to a young man as a visit to an old one, by suggesting that he had a few old books and some other things, all old like himself, he said, which I might find of interest for a half-hour. I went as I had promised, more from a sense of duty, I must admit, than from any other motive, even that of curiosity to see his old books. But I found, as he had said, that he had a rare collection both of books and of other things, the rarest I had ever seen, and he himself seemed just a part of it. His house itself was a rare one, an example of the fine old double houses, built on a simple and dignified plan, almost square with that adherence to the simple classic models, adapted for room, sunshine, and air, which we now call Colonial, perhaps because it is so long since we departed from them in the vain endeavor to be showy and fine. It was as different from the new houses near it as its master himself was from the other men on the street. A handsome portico with Doric columns, once white, but now a soft gray, dignified its front. The fine door, with a large fan-shaped leaded transom above, and a brass lock strong enough to have secured the Bastille, was itself a feature, and admitted you to the ample hall, which ran entirely through the house to where the rear door and a long back double portico beyond it looked out on a tangled garden. A stairway sufficiently wide to suggest ampleness in the rooms above led winding up on one side of the hall to the upper floor. The front door was not only equipped with a bell, which, when I pulled the handle, jangled for more than a minute somewhere to the rear outside the house, but it was garnished with a handsome, highly polished, old brass knocker of a classical design. Everything was solid, and had once been handsome, but struck me now as sadly out of repair. Indeed, an air of neglect and loneliness seemed to pervade the whole place. It was not until I had both rung and knocked several times that an elderly Negro woman came around the side of the house and, after looking at me with an air of inspection, asked whom I wanted to see. I found things much the same way within that they were without. The walls were hung with paintings, some of which seemed to me fine, but they were dim and blistered, and the frames were all dingy and old. The room I was shown into was furnished with old mahogany furniture, rich with age, and was filled with handsome things, but everything appeared to me to be placed without regard either to fitness or comfort. The chairs were all ranged back stiffly against the wall, and vases and other bric-a-brac were scattered around in a pell-mell, hopeless fashion that was distressing. The library, into which I was at length shown, was the only exception to this condition. It was large and airy, and was evidently a living-room, and the fine old books, many of them in rich binding, redeemed everything. Yet here likewise were the signs of neglect which spoke from every spot. Books piled on tables and chairs, and even on the floor, in a confusion which nobody but one long familiar to it could have understood. My host, however, who met me most graciously when I was at length shown into the library, seemed to divine where things were in that room at least, and made my visit so agreeable that instead of passing 1/2 hour with him, I spent the evening. He lived almost entirely in the past.
"An old man like myself," he said, "has to live in the past. My friends are all there."
He possessed a knowledge of books which appeared to me rare, and what was more, he had that delightful art of endowing books of which he talked with a certain personality, which made them seem like living beings. He did not quote books so much as he made them speak for themselves. In his mouth they were not books, but the men who wrote them. He had evidently lived with them much. He brought their authors in and made them talk with you. He appeared particularly fond of the poets and the essayists, though he declared there were very few of either nowadays who were sincere.
"They are the true philosophers," he declared. "When you find a sincere man in a book, sir, cherish him. He is like a sincere man in life. You know him at once, and he is rara avis. The old ones were sincere. There was something in the time that made men sincere. Shakespeare, of course, I remember he said, because he knew the human soul and could not help it. It was as if he had stood face to face with God and dared not tell anything but truth. Milton was sincere because he was a fanatic. Bacon because he was too wise not to be."
Of the moderns, he said, old Johnson was almost the only essayist who was always sincere, and that was his value. You could always count on him. He was, moreover,
a man of heart, a clear, vigorous man who saw straight and told it as he saw it.
The others were
nearly all posing, writing either for popularity or for some other miserable end. "Why, sir," he said, "I have piles of them there I will not even put on my shelves. I will not admit them to the companionship of gentlemen. The poets at least try to do something. Some of them do. Goldsmith, for all his fopperies, was sincere because he was a poet. His pen inspired him. It was the key that turned on the divine fluid. Johnson said of him, you know, that no man was more foolish till he took up his pen, and more wise when he took it up. Wordsworth was always sincere for the same reason. They had a high idea of their profession, as poets and preachers must have."
I asked him about Carlyle and Emerson, for I was just then discovering them. He admitted the sincerity of both, but Carlyle he did not like.
"He is always ill-tempered and sour, and is forever sneering at others. He is Jeremiah, without his inspiration or his occasion," he said of him. "He is not a gentleman, sir, and has never forgiven either the world or himself for it."
"Do you not think he writes well?" I demanded.
"Yes, sir, he writes vigorously. I suppose you mean that. But it is not English. I do not know just what to term it. It was a trick with him, a part of his pedantry. But when I want acerbity, I prefer Swift."
Emerson he put on a much higher plane than Carlyle, but though he admitted his sincerity and ranked him as the first American literary man, he did not read him much.
"He is a kindly man," he said, "and has wrought in a sad sincerity. But he preaches too much for me, and he is all texts. When I want preaching, I go to church. At least, I do when I can find it," he said after a pause. That is not so often these days."
His eyes kindled.
"The pulpit has lost its power, sir, thrown away its best prerogative, the gift of preaching. The clergy no more preach with power because they no more believe with strength. They find many of the old dogma undermined and worthless, and think the whole structure is tottering. So they set to work to build up the entire fabric anew. They waste their puny strength laying a few sticks about the foundation. They do not apprehend that deep down lies the solid rock unshaken, and that on this alone man's spiritual nature craves to rest. The Roman Church knows this. It is wise, for it is the garner house of experience. Why should I go to hear a young man, of far less knowledge than myself, holding forth to worldly people worldly considerations, to induce them to embrace a religion of which the founder preached the blessedness of sorrow? The poorest preacher, sir, is impressive so long as he believes himself the minister of God. I may not accept his message, but if he believes in his mission, I shall respect him. If, however, he questions his own credentials, I will not listen to him. But I am getting to preaching myself," he said with a smile. "We were speaking of the essayists? After all," he said, "the best of these essayists to me is the first, Plutarch, and next to him the second, Montaigne. Plutarch is as modern as if he had just written, because he knew human nature. Human nature is always the same. Montaigne drew from Plutarch, and the others from Montaigne. They have all been pillaging him ever since he wrote. He was a man who knew himself as he was, and had the wit and the courage to be truthful. Montaigne was not so great as Plutarch, because he was less spiritual. His time was not so great. But he knew the human mind, as Shakespeare knew both the mind and the heart. Why, sir," he added with unwonted enthusiasm, "I am enough like Montaigne to be his embodied spirit. When I read Montaigne, I feel as if I were reading myself. It is a pleasure to me to know that they are the two which we have some grounds to believe Shakespeare read. You cannot get a man nowadays to tell you what he really feels or thinks. Feeling has gone out of fashion. Everyone is trying to repress his feeling, and he does not think at all. Convention has taken the place of originality. Why, sir, we are all trying to say what we think our neighbor thinks."
It does not seem to me now, recalling it, that what he said was altogether sound, but there was something about his manner in saying it which impressed me. He appeared to be in strong opposition to the rest of the world, and to hold a correct position, but to have a tendency to push his views to extremes. He did not see things precisely as they were, but through a medium or atmosphere of some kind, which threw them a little out of line, as if a man might look at objects through a pane of old, uneven glass. I observed the same tendency when he spoke of old times and things. His talk of old days was delightful, but even this was critical, his reminiscences being, I thought, all a little tinged by something. I would not call it sourness, but just a bit off from the sweet savour of perfect mellowness, as if at some period he had been shut off a little too much from the sun, and had ripened under the shadow of disappointment. When I came away, he accompanied me to the door, and his last words surprised me.
"Young man, domestic happiness is worth all the fame in the world."
It was a cry out of the dark. I left him with something of sadness, passing out of the wide, cheerless hall and through the old weather-blistered door, and I was not aware until I got into the sunshine without how chilly I had been within. I had an indescribable feeling of half sorrow, half pity for the old gentleman, which did not change until I met him again out of doors, calm, dignified, and serene, with his courtly manner. I also had a feeling of sadness for myself. I came out of his presence half in love with a picture of a young girl in a flower-trimmed hat, half in love with a memory. I met the old gentleman occasionally after that, and always with a feeling of mingled regard and sympathy. I could hardly tell why I had this feeling, for I set him down as one of the most self-contained and fortunate of men, A man who, with enough means to gratify his tastes and follow his own bent, chose to live just as he pleased. In fact, I think I began rather to envy him, for my little affair in which the Miss Tennyson figured had not ended very satisfactorily to me. The vicarious recipient of the volumes had smiled more kindly than I liked on a smooth-cheeked young man who had an undeniable advantage over me in the silkiness of his mustache, the freshness of his complexion, and the nimbleness of his heels, not to mention the matter of income, in which he probably quadrupled mine. But I not only believed these were the only advantages he had over me, but was conceited enough to have even a mild contempt for him, which, nevertheless, did not prevent my young lady from at first openly favoring him, and afterwards bestowing on him not only herself, but my Tennyson as well, side-marked passages and all. I had not even the poor consolation of thinking that he would see the passages and be jealous, for I do not believe he ever opened the book, or, for that matter, any book in his life. Yet when I saw them together, they were happier than two turtle doves. Anyhow, the affair left me with a certain feeling of discontent, not only with the world at large, but, a much harder thing to bear, with myself also. And I rather envied my old gentleman of the Blackstock, his quiet, untroubled life. About this time, the vision of the little country girl with the big rose-covered hat began to come back to me again, and took its place once more in my recollection. End of Chapter 4. This has been The Old Gentleman of the Blackstock by Thomas Nelson Page, illustrated by Howard Chandler Christie. Original copyright 1897. This edition copyright 1901. Production copyright 2025 by Laura E. Richcreek. Thanks for being here. See you next week.